How many letters never reached their destination? In the brutal winter of 1950, thousands of young men marched into a frozen wasteland, holding onto a singular, fragile promise: they would be home before Christmas. Instead, they were swallowed by a white abyss. Out of the vast numbers deployed to the Chosin Reservoir, entire units vanished into the blinding snow, their final thoughts captured in frozen ink on crumpled pages that would take decades to be found, if they were ever found at all. We often look at war through the cold lens of grand strategy, moving flags on a map, but the true weight of history lies in the pockets of the forgotten, in the silent moments when a soldier realizes the world has left him behind. If you are drawn to the untold truths of the past, to the raw reality of those who marched into a tragic fate while history looked away, make sure you join our community by subscribing to the channel. Today we unfold a piece of paper that survived the coldest hell on Earth, revealing a psychological toll that official military records tried to bury beneath the ice. The end of the world is not bathed in fire. It is blindingly white, entirely silent, and unforgivingly cold. In late November 1950, the mountains surrounding the Chosin Reservoir in North Korea became a landscape of profound desolation. Temperatures plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. The wind did not just blow. It carved through heavy canvas coats, freezing the very moisture in the air and turning every breath into a sharp ache in the lungs. For the young men of the infantry units stationed along those jagged ridges, the environment was not merely a backdrop. It was a relentless adversary. High command had assured these soldiers that the conflict was drawing to a swift close. The offensive was supposed to be a final, triumphant push that would see them eating warm dinners with their families by late December. But as the snow began to fall, heavily and without pause, that bright promise shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces of ice. But we need to stop and consider the terrifying reality of this specific environment, stripping away the romanticism of military campaigns. Imagine a place so devoid of warmth that rations turned into solid blocks of stone, requiring men to thaw them inside their own clothing just to consume a few calories. Weapons seized up, rendering steel useless. Medical supplies became a cruel joke, with vital liquids freezing solid in their glass vials. It was an ecosystem mathematically designed to extinguish human life. In the midst of this freezing expanse, where sheer survival demanded every ounce of cognitive energy, the simple act of holding onto a memory, a thought of home, became a monumental psychological effort. The mind begins to shut down before the body does. And yet, amid the howling gales and the creeping numbness that claimed so many in the dark, one incredibly fragile item defied the elements. A simple, battered piece of paper. It did not carry strategic orders from generals sitting in heated tents, nor did it hold grand declarations of cinematic heroism. It carried the desperate, fading whispers of a young man, Corporal William Smith, who watched the white curtain closing around his unit, knowing full well what hid behind the silence of the snow. Let us step away from the grand maps of generals and focus on the immediate reality of a foxhole measuring barely 3 feet deep, carved desperately into the unforgiving earth. Here, we find Corporal William Smith. Imagine the physical toll of simply existing in that space. To touch the steel of an M1 Garand rifle without thick gloves meant leaving the skin of your palm seared onto the metal, a brutal reality of the front lines that stripped away any illusion of glory. Every exhalation created a thick plume of white fog that instantly crystallized on eyebrows and scarves, sealing men inside masks of their own frozen breath. Sleep was not a refuge. It was a constant looming threat. To close your eyes for too long was to invite the cold to claim you entirely, slipping into a final, quiet slumber from which there was no waking up. In the brief, haunting silences between the distant echoes of artillery, Smith attempted something that required more profound strength than holding a weapon. He took out a small, worn piece of paper and a pen. He wanted to write to his mother. Think about the immense psychological anchor that home represents when you are surrounded by an endless expanse of hostile white. The contrast is almost violent, tearing at the fabric of a soldier's sanity. On one side of the globe, a warm kitchen, the comforting smells of a Sunday evening, the soft murmur of a radio playing a familiar tune. On the other, a jagged hole in the frozen terrain of North Korea, where young men huddled together, shivering so violently that the sound of it echoed in the dark. Smith unbuttoned his heavy canvas layers, exposing himself to the lethal wind for just a few precious seconds, long enough to retrieve his pen from where he kept it nestled near his heart. He hoped, with a desperate kind of optimism, that his own fading body heat would keep the ink fluid, but the environment of Chosin was merciless. As he pressed the tip of the pen to the paper to form the very first letters, the ink refused to flow. It was freezing the exact moment it met the biting air. The desperate struggle to carve a few words of comfort for the woman who raised him became a heartbreaking, physical battle against nature itself. He pressed harder, the nib scratching the fragile paper, leaving faint, desperate indentations. The letters were barely visible, a ghost of a message trying to break through the winter. It is in these microscopic, devastating moments that the true weight of the front lines reveals itself. History books meticulously record the dates of the offensive and the names of the commanding officers, but they rarely capture the quiet agony of a young man watching his last connection to humanity freeze solid in his trembling hands. Smith knew, with the kind of primal intuition that only surfaces when a human being is pushed past the absolute limit, that this might be his final communication. And yet, the very elements were silencing him before he could even say goodbye. What does it do to a man's mind when nature itself seems to conspire with the opposing forces to erase his existence? How heavy does the darkness become when you realize your final words will remain forever trapped inside your own mind? But here, we must pause and ask a fundamental question. How does an entire army march straight into the jaws of a frozen trap without anyone sounding the alarm? The tragedy of the Chosin Reservoir was not merely a failure of logistics, it was a catastrophic failure of imagination on the part of military intelligence. While Corporal Smith and thousands of others were fighting to keep their ink and their bodies from freezing, reports were already surfacing about massive troop movements in the mountains. Yet, in the heated offices of high command, far removed from the biting winds of the front line, these reports were dismissed as mere rumors or vast exaggerations. There was an overwhelming, almost blinding arrogance permeating the strategic rooms, a steadfast belief that the opposing forces would not dare to launch a massive counter-offensive in such uninhabitable conditions. The dissonance between those giving the orders and those executing them creates one of the most haunting echoes of this campaign. Imagine sitting in a comfortable, climate-controlled headquarters miles away, looking at a map and casually moving a piece of plastic that represents 10,000 human lives. Now, contrast that with the staggering reality on the ground, where men were beginning to realize that the mountains around them were not empty. The enemy was invisible, a phantom force moving strictly by night, wearing white canvas to blend seamlessly into the snowdrifts, and maintaining absolute stillness during the day to evade aerial reconnaissance. They were a shadow army of over 120,000 men, quietly encircling the 30,000 troops who had been explicitly told they were marching toward a swift and definitive victory. For the soldiers in the foxholes, the realization of their doom did not come with a dramatic announcement. It came as a creeping, suffocating dread. It was the sudden severing of communication lines. It was the unsettling, heavy silence that fell over the ridges, a silence that felt entirely too deliberate. When you are cut off from the rest of the world, geography itself becomes a prison. The vast, mountainous terrain that was supposed to be their pathway home had suddenly transformed into towering fortress walls, locking them inside a freezing cage. The psychological weight of this realization is almost impossible to quantify. To be cold is one thing. To be cold, utterly isolated, abandoned by your own commander's oversight, and surrounded by an unseen force that outnumbers you 4-1, creates a profound mental collapse long before the darkness falls. When the sun finally dipped below the jagged ridges of the Chosin Reservoir, it took with it the last fragile remnants of hope. Nightfall in that frozen expanse was not merely the absence of light. It was the arrival of a suffocating, almost tangible terror. The temperature, already sitting at an impossible low, plummeted even further, plunging the valleys into a darkness so absolute that men could not see the hands trembling in front of their own faces. In modern warfare, the night is often a time to regroup, to rest, and to prepare for the dawn. But for Corporal Smith and the thousands of isolated men trapped in those shallow, icy trenches, the night was the primary adversary. It brought with it the most insidious threat of all: the desperate, overwhelming biological urge to close their eyes. To fall asleep in Chosin was to embrace a final, silent surrender. The cold did not attack violently, it sedated. It started in the extremities, a slow numbness that crept up the legs and arms, deceiving the body with a false sense of warmth. Men who had been shivering uncontrollably for hours would suddenly stop. A profound, heavy calmness would wash over them, a physiological lie masking the fact that their core temperature was fatally dropping. The soldiers knew this. They had seen their friends simply nod off while leaning against the dirt walls, slipping into the shadows, never to wake again. The sheer willpower required to fight this seductive pull, minute after agonizing minute, hour after endless hour, created a level of psychological exhaustion that defies human comprehension. Imagine existing in that liminal space between extreme sleep deprivation and freezing agony. After 48 hours without rest, the human mind begins to fracture. The silence of the night was not truly silent. It was filled with the howling of the wind, a sound that distorted and twisted as it echoed through the canyons. Exhausted men began to experience vivid auditory and visual hallucinations. The shadows of dead trees morphed into advancing figures. The crack of shifting ice sounded exactly like the snap of a rifle bolt. Corporal Smith, staring into the impenetrable blackness, had to constantly question whether the figures he saw moving in the periphery of his vision were the enemy tightening the noose, or simply the desperate projections of his own collapsing mind. There was no radio contact to offer a voice of reason. There was only the sound of his own shallow, labored breathing. As the hours dragged on, an unspoken collective realization settled over the frozen foxholes. The sky above remained empty. The heavy cloud cover and the unrelenting snowstorms meant that the aerial support they had been promised was grounded. The grand machinery of the military, with all its aircraft and supply drops, had been rendered entirely impotent by the weather. They were completely and utterly alone. Stripped of the illusion of rescue, the men were left with nothing but the stark reality of their situation. They were not fighting for a strategic objective anymore. They were fighting to survive the next 10 minutes. But as the first pale, gray light of morning began to bleed into the sky, it brought no warmth and no relief. Instead, it brought whispers of an order that would test the very limits of their endurance, an order that would force them to leave the miserable safety of their trenches and walk directly into the frozen unknown. The order to break out of the Chosin Reservoir was not a tactical maneuver of triumph. It was a desperate march into a freezing void. When the command finally reached Corporal Smith and his unit, there was no cheering, no surge of adrenaline. There was only the grim understanding that the trenches they were leaving behind would become the final resting place for many of the men who simply could not stand up. Moving a human body that has been immobilized in sub-zero temperatures for days is an agonizing process. Muscles tear, joints lock, and the sheer effort of putting one foot in front of the other requires a monumental expenditure of a rapidly depleting life force. The column of men that began to wind its way down the narrow, treacherous mountain passes looked less like a military formation and more like a procession of ghosts wandering through purgatory. As they descended, the true horror of their situation materialized. The enemy forces, having waited patiently in the surrounding elevations, began to close the trap. But the engagement that followed was stripped of the usual chaotic noise of warfare. The extreme cold muffled the sound of artillery, and the deep snow absorbed the impact of mortar shells, turning the battlefield into a surreal, slow-motion nightmare. Men did not fall with dramatic cries. They simply folded into the snowdrift silently, exhausted beyond the point of feeling pain. Claimed by the biting wind as much as by the incoming fire, to be struck down in Chosin was often met with a tragic, quiet acceptance, a final surrender to the overwhelming desire to simply stop moving. For Corporal Smith, the world narrowed down to the boots of the man walking immediately in front of him. Every step was a negotiation with gravity and despair. The march stretched over miles of hostile territory, a gauntlet of ice and shadows where the line between the living and the lost blurred entirely. Vehicles that had frozen solid were pushed off the cliffs to clear the narrow roads, tumbling silently into the abysses below. Those who could no longer walk were placed on the hoods of the few functioning jeeps, their fragile forms enduring the relentless winter. The sheer collective will required to keep the column moving forward is one of the most haunting testaments to human endurance in modern history, yet it came at an unfathomable cost. But human endurance has a breaking point. Somewhere along that desolate road, as the unit faced yet another sudden advance from the high ground, the cohesion of Smith's group began to fracture. The blinding snow returned, reducing visibility to a mere handful of feet. In the ensuing confusion, amidst the swirling whiteout and the shadowy figures darting across the ridges, men were separated from the main column. To lose sight of the convoy in that environment was a definitive end. There were no search parties. There was no going back. You simply became part of the landscape. It was in this chaotic, ghostly expanse that Corporal Smith's physical journey faded into the historical record, his youth swallowed by the immense, indifferent white void, leaving behind only the cold wind and a fragile piece of paper. The physical form of Corporal William Smith was ultimately claimed by the merciless winter of the Chosin Reservoir, joining the thousands of young men who met their definitive end in that white abyss. But while the soldier faded into the snow, the fragile, battered piece of paper he had fought so desperately to write did not. Years later, when the geopolitical ice shifted and recovery teams were finally allowed to search those distant ridges for the remains of the fallen, they found the personal effects that the cold had perfectly preserved. Among rusted dog tags and hardened canvas, the letter was recovered. It was barely legible, the ink having crystallized before it could properly stain the paper, leaving behind faint indentations of words that carried the unimaginable weight of a shattered world. When we look at military archives, we are usually presented with a sanitized version of history. We see lines drawn on maps, strategic victories, and treaties signed in grand halls. But those numbers and official reports do not tell the truth of war. The truth is found in the quiet, devastating spaces between those lines. It is found in the desperate, fading scratches of a frozen pen. The recovered letter did not speak of grand ideologies, nor did it curse the commanders who had sent his unit into an inescapable trap. It spoke simply of the cold, of a profound longing for the smell of his mother's kitchen, and of a quiet, fading hope that he would see her again. It stands today as a heartbreaking monument to the mundane, beautiful life he was forced to leave behind. The true tragedy of Chosin, and of all conflicts that strip humanity down to its barest elements, is not just the physical toll. It is the loss of unlived futures. It is the millions of letters that were never finished, the words of comfort that never reached the mothers, the wives, and the children waiting desperately by the window. When the ink froze on William Smith's pen, it captured the exact moment a young man realized the world was moving on without him. Yet he refused to let go of his humanity. He chose love over despair in a place where only despair thrived. We must ask ourselves, how many other silent testimonies remain buried beneath the ice, or lost in the dark mud of forgotten battlefields, waiting for someone to listen? If we are to truly understand the past, we cannot simply read the reports written by those who survived in the comfort of command tents, far away from the front lines. We must listen to the silent echoes of those who marched into the shadows. We must carry the weight of their unspoken words, ensuring that their final, lonely moments are never erased by the passage of time. If this journey into the hidden corners of history has moved you, make sure to leave your thoughts below and subscribe to the channel. Help us keep the memories of these forgotten individuals alive, sharing their truths with a world that often looks the other way. Until next time, remember that the loudest stories are often the ones that were frozen in silence.